The morning felt heavier than usual as he stepped out of his car, clutching a thin white envelope that carried the weight of humiliation. The HOA office looked calm from outside, its glass front reflecting the quiet neighborhood he had lived in for 3 years. But inside, it was a different world, one ruled by people who loved rules more than people, and who treated fines like their personal entertainment. He walked toward the front door, replaying everything that led up to this moment. It had started with something so small he almost ignored it, a barely noticeable patch of grass on the left side of his lawn, slightly yellow, struggling against the heatwave that had hit the area last month. He knew it wasn't a big deal. The neighbors knew it wasn't a big deal. Even the mailman had joked that the entire street looked exhausted from the sun. But the HOA didn't care. They didn't see a small dry patch, they saw a chance to send a fine. A bright orange slip had been taped to his front door with a level of enthusiasm only HOA board members seemed capable of. It wasn't the amount that bothered him, although it was ridiculous. It was the way it was written, cold, condescending, and designed to make him feel beneath them. A warning disguised as a bill. A message saying, "We control this place." He tried fixing the patch immediately, watering it, treating it, even replacing a section, but before anything could recover, another fine arrived. This time the letter described him as neglectful, as if he had committed some offense against the entire community. After the third fine arrived, the one in his hand today, he knew he had to go in person. Not to fight them. Not to argue. Just to pay it so they would leave him alone. Walking into the HOA building, he felt the cold air hit him, along with the familiar presence of people who enjoyed enforcing authority. The board members sat behind the long counter, looking both bored and amused. They recognized him instantly. They didn't hide their smirks. They loved when people came in to pay fines. To them, it felt like victory. He handed over the envelope. The board members didn't bother hiding their amusement as they processed it. While they typed, they exchanged looks that made it clear they saw him as just another powerless resident forced to obey. The tension in the room felt thick, like they were silently mocking him. They acted as if he should feel ashamed, as if they were doing him a favor by accepting the payment. As he stood there, he felt something shift inside him. The laughter, the smug expressions, the ease with which they controlled people, he realized he had underestimated how deeply this system was broken. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. Small power in small hands, used loudly. One board member turned to the large wall-mounted digital screen, a system used to log payments and update records. She tapped a button, ready to update his file. The moment she did, the screen refreshed with a loud electronic chime. The board expected the usual, a normal resident profile, a brief record of fines, and a confirmation of payment. But that wasn't what appeared. Instead, the screen displayed a bold header that made every board member freeze. Their expressions shifted from amusement to confusion, then to shock. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too tense. The screen now showed a completely different panel. A tab labeled Ownership Overview appeared, something none of them were used to seeing. Under it, in large letters, appeared a name, his name, next to the title, Primary Stakeholder. The board members leaned closer, blinking, trying to understand what they were seeing. The system wasn't malfunctioning, it was revealing something they had never expected. Their faces drained of color. Their smirks vanished. For the first time, they looked unsure, small, unsettled. He stood still, calm, silently watching their reactions. He knew this moment would come. Eventually, but he hadn't planned for it to happen like this. He had kept the information private for a long time, not out of secrecy, but because he had never intended to use it. But now, watching them stare at the screen, everything made sense. They had pushed too far. The ownership records on the screen were official, irrefutable. They showed the real structure behind the neighborhood, a parent company that owned the land, the houses, and the HOA system itself. And next to that company name was the list of its stakeholders. His name wasn't just on the list, it was at the top. The board members scrambled, clicking buttons, trying to hide the page, trying to force the system back to the normal view. But the system required authentication to close the ownership tab, and none of them had the authority level to override it. They were stuck staring at the truth. A heavy silence wrapped the room. One member tried to speak but stopped halfway as the realization settled in: the man they had mocked, fined, and humiliated wasn't just a regular resident. He was their boss. He was the highest-ranking owner of the entire neighborhood. He was the one person they were supposed to respect the most, and they had treated him like the least. The atmosphere twisted, turning their laughter into fear. Not loud fear, but quiet, sinking fear. The kind that made people swallow hard and rethink every action they had ever taken. And standing there, watching them tremble, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: control. Not petty control. Real control. As the board members stayed frozen, trying to figure out what would happen next, he turned toward the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain anything. He simply walked out, leaving them with the image on the screen and the consequences that would follow. Outside, the wind felt different. Lighter. Sharper. He knew the real storm was about to begin, and this time he wasn't the one being pushed around. This time, he was the one holding all the power. And the neighborhood was about to learn exactly what that meant. The silence inside the HOA office didn't stay silent for long. The moment he stepped outside, the board erupted into frantic motion. Chairs scraped. Papers dropped. People whispered in sharp, panicked breaths. The screen was still stuck on the ownership page, displaying the one truth they were never meant to ignore: the man they humiliated was the primary stakeholder of the entire neighborhood. For years, the HOA board operated like a tiny monarchy. They held meetings where they pretended to be important, enforcing rules that barely made sense, issuing fines out of boredom, and treating residents as if they were beneath them. And now, with one accidental screen refresh, their entire world cracked open. They weren't in control anymore. They never really were. Word moved through the board faster than wind through the trees. They scrambled for their phones, dialing higher-ups, desperately searching for someone, anyone, who could undo the mistake. But the parent company offered no shield, because the system was correct. The company had recently shifted majority ownership to its private investors, and out of everyone on the list, he held the most shares. Quietly. Quiet enough that the HOA had never learned his name. He reached home before any of them could catch up. The air felt different now. Not peaceful. Not calm. More like the quiet before a sweeping storm. The neighborhood looked normal on the surface: trimmed lawns, quiet driveways, peaceful pathways, but everything beneath that calm was beginning to shift. Behind the scenes, the HOA had already fallen into chaos. Board members held an emergency gathering inside their glass office. They talked over each other, pacing, sweating, panicking as they replayed every interaction they ever had with him. The fines suddenly looked reckless. The warnings looked foolish. Their arrogance now felt dangerous. Slowly, fear turned into desperation. Some of them suggested deleting the records. Others suggested pretending not had happened. But the system was locked. The folder marked "ownership" was protected under permissions that only one person in the entire neighborhood possessed, the very person they had spent weeks mocking and fining. The pressure inside that small building was enough to break loyalty. 2 board members blamed the chairwoman. 3 blamed the system. 1 blamed the entire concept of homeowners associations. Their whispers grew sharp, their breaths uneven, their confidence all but destroyed. Meanwhile, he sat at home with a calmness they could never understand. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't even celebrate. He simply waited. Because he knew what was coming: the inevitable knock on his door, the attempt at fake apologies, the sudden shift in behavior. And he was right. By late afternoon, HOA cars circled his street, not aggressively, but quietly, like they were afraid to be seen. The board members didn't dare approach together. Instead, they sent one representative, hoping a softer face might undo what the morning had revealed. But he didn't answer the door. The attempt at reconciliation hung in the air, unanswered, making the board even more uneasy. Inside the HOA building, chaos evolved into strategy. They searched the bylaws, desperate for loopholes. They looked at the fine system, realizing how messy and unfair it looked when examined by someone with authority. They reviewed complaints from other residents, complaints they had ignored, now understanding that every ignored voice could become a problem if he chose to investigate. For the first time, they saw the neighborhood the way residents saw it, a place controlled by a handful of power-hungry people who thought too highly of themselves. And in that realization, fear dug in deeper. But while panic consumed them, he spent the evening studying something else, the entire structure of the HOA itself. Documents, decisions, budgets, fines, misuse of funds, questionable maintenance charges. Everything they tried to hide behind complicated wording and legal phrasing was suddenly clear to him. The more he read, the more he saw the truth: the HOA had been mismanaging the community for years. Not just with strict enforcement, but with money, with favoritism, with decisions that benefited themselves more than residents. They thought they were untouchable. They thought no one would ever question them. They were wrong. Night settled into the neighborhood as lights flickered on in houses lining the street. People walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes. Life looked peaceful from the outside. But inside the HOA building, a storm gathered. And inside his house, a different kind of storm prepared to be unleashed, not from anger, but from authority. By the next morning, the board members looked exhausted. Dark circles under their eyes. Their confidence replaced by dread. They whispered every time they passed each other, terrified of losing their positions, their influence, their carefully constructed control. They made one last attempt to reach him, an official email filled with polite phrases they had never used before. But he didn't respond. Not because he enjoyed ignoring them, but because he needed time. Time to plan. Time to understand just how deep their mismanagement went. He wasn't interested in small revenge. He wasn't interested in petty victory. The kind of power he held required something larger, something decisive, a complete restructuring of the community they had destroyed with their arrogance. The HOA board didn't sleep that night, but he did. Comfortably. Calmly. Because while they were drowning in fear, he was already moving towards something bigger, something that would change the entire neighborhood forever. And as the sun rose on the third day, the real story, the one that would shake every resident, was finally ready to begin. Morning sunlight slid across the quiet streets as the neighborhood slowly came to life, unaware of the transformation about to unfold. Birds rested on rooftops. Sprinklers flicked on across manicured lawns. Residents walked out with coffee in hand, starting their day without knowing that everything around them was standing on the edge of a shift they'd remember for years. He woke with a calm, steady focus. Today wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood from people who had used it as their personal kingdom. He had spent the last 2 days going through records, documents, logs, and financial statements that the HOA hid behind complex language. But the truth was simple: they had failed the community they claimed to protect. Quietly, he gathered the folders he had prepared: evidence, reports, violations, misuse of funds, and every hidden decision they thought no one would ever see. He slipped everything into a black binder, closed it, and walked toward the door. There was no anger on his face, no rush in his steps. Only purpose. At the HOA building, the board members were already on edge. They had arrived early, hoping to prepare some kind of defense or excuse. But none of them could focus. Their nerves were too frayed. Their thoughts too scattered. Every sound of footsteps made them flinch. Every rustle of paper reminded them that the ground beneath their authority was breaking. When he finally walked through the front door, their faces shifted instantly. Fear replaced arrogance. Uncertainty replaced superiority. The smirks they once wore so easily were gone, stripped away by the realization of who he really was. The board members sat in rigid silence as he placed the binder on the table. He opened it calmly, turning one page after another, laying out each piece of evidence. Budget inconsistencies. Excessive maintenance fees with no documented work. Fines issued without cause, mostly targeting residents they personally disliked. Misfiled payments. Hidden charges. Records that contradicted official reports. A pattern of abuse so deep that even the board members couldn't deny it anymore. One by one, their faces drained of confidence. Their shoulders hunched. Their eyes dropped to the table. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a place of power, it felt like a courtroom. He didn't need to speak to create impact. His presence alone, the calmness with which he laid out their failures, was enough to dismantle them. Every page made their positions weaker. Every document cut through the illusion they had built around themselves. The realization hit them slowly, painfully, they had lost everything. Outside, residents began gathering near the entrance, drawn by the sight of HOA cars, nervous board members, and tension hanging in the air. They didn't know the details yet, but they sensed that something important was happening, something long overdue. Inside, he closed the binder and placed a final document on the table, the authorization form granting him full administrative control over the HOA. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply the truth of ownership, backed by the parent company, verified by the system, and legally binding. The board members understood instantly. Their control was gone. Their positions were over. Their decisions no longer mattered. And for the first time, the neighborhood belonged to someone who actually cared about it. Relief that someone had finally stepped in. Someone who wasn't seeking power, but justice. Someone who wasn't enforcing rules, but restoring fairness. As he approached the center of the neighborhood, something deeper unfolded. People stepped out from their homes, curious and hopeful. A few exchanged looks that carried years of frustration, memories of unfair fines, harsh notices, and being treated like problems instead of people. Without saying a word, he began implementing the changes the community needed. Outdated rules were reviewed. Unnecessary fines were voided. Maintenance budgets were redirected into actual improvements instead of personal perks. Tactics of intimidation were replaced with transparency. And slowly, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA building, once a symbol of control, became a place of accountability. The board members who misused their positions were removed. New members were brought in, residents who wanted fairness instead of authority. People who wanted to help, not dominate. Word spread fast. Not through official announcements, but through whispers, conversations on sidewalks, nods exchanged between neighbors who had spent years feeling powerless. The relief moved through the streets like fresh air. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel watched, it felt protected. He didn't chase praise. He didn't seek recognition. He simply returned to his home, knowing he had done what needed to be done. The neighborhood didn't belong to the board anymore. It didn't belong to people obsessed with rules. It belonged to the people who lived in it. As the sun began to set, casting warm light across the newly quiet community, he stood in his driveway for a moment. The same driveway where the first fine had been taped. The same spot where the trouble had begun. But the feeling was different now, lighter, calm, complete. He looked around at the place he had fought for, not with anger or revenge, but with quiet strength. And rightful authority. The neighborhood wasn't perfect yet. But it was finally free. And this time, no one would ever laugh at him again, because now, everyone knew exactly who owned the place.